Welcome to the Daily Faceoff Show, your everyday source for the latest news with top-notch insight and analysis. Live every weekday at noon Eastern.
Bienvenue à Montreal, the 2022 NHL Draft here at the Bell Center tonight, Thursday night, 7 p.m. Eastern. Welcome to the Daily Faceoff Show, presented today by the 2022 World Junior Hockey Championship. Individual tickets are on sale now, starting at just $40. Put your shades on. The best stars in junior hockey, the brightest stars in junior hockey, including a lot of the guys that will be drafted tonight here in Montreal, will be in Edmonton this August. Welcome in to Bell Center and welcome into the Daily Faceoff Show, streaming live on YouTube, Twitter, as well as, of course, dailyfaceoff.com. Alongside my partner in crime, Scott Burnside. We are here trying to get set for the draft. Scott, how you doing?
I'm doing well. I loved how you brought in the new intro music here at the Bell Center. Had it timed just perfectly as they're getting ready for what will be a historic first-round pick for the Montreal Canadiens, first time in decades. And I think it's fair to say that this entire city is really alive. Maybe it's because it's the first in-person draft in 3 years, but there's a terrific vibe in this city about that.
There always is. They care so much about their hockey here. It's great to have it not just in person, but in a place that really cares, and also with some real potential drama at play. So let's throw 2 minutes and 30 seconds up on the clock, and let's start with that drama in the sense that, Scott, I've been to, 15 drafts. You've been to well more than that. I can't remember a one heading into the night that's more unsettled. Who will the Montreal Canadiens take at number 1 overall? Will they not overthink it? Will they just take Shane Wright? Do they have something else up their sleeve? And either way, what will be the reaction and buzz in this building?
Well, I do. I'm expecting that the fans will treat the moment with its proper respect, and whoever ends up with the number 1 pick, whether it's Shane Wright or whether the Canadiens go a different direction, that the fans will be enthusiastic about it. But it is, and you and I were talking about this before, in talking to scouts and managers around the NHL, this might be the most fluid draft of all the drafts that you and I have been at together. And I think that speaks to, the lack of a identifiable generational player like a Connor McDavid or a Nathan McKinnon or Sidney Crosby. It doesn't mean there aren't good players. There are really good players available, but especially even through the top 10, I've heard people talk about the top 15. It's very fluid. And if you went from 32 teams and looked at their draft boards, I can guarantee you, no two would look the same, even through the first 15 picks.
Oh, I think it goes way deeper than that. I think teams are actually very excited to see how 15 through 40 go. You could potentially get the same quality of player from 15 or 17 to 40. And not only that, and we've talked about this over the last number of months with Chris Peters, the uncertainty that surrounds sort of, the scouting process, and we'll get into that in a bit with Chris. But you look at, it's still not a normal draft year, and I think that's also a big part of it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think it really does test, when you talk to scouts, and we always say this every year, how important the draft is. You cannot win in this league, not in the salary cap, and certainly not in the flat cap league, if you do not draft and develop players properly. And that doesn't mean just hitting on your first round picks. If you don't come up with 2 or 3 players out of your 7 that you draft, then it's really hard because you end up spending money in free agency, or you end up trading for a more experienced, more expensive player. You just can't make it if you aren't drafting and developing properly. And we see that. And the teams that struggle are more often than not teams that struggle with drafting and developing.
Right, and for a series of years. And I think the other interesting part about this draft, you mentioned the lack of a generational talent. The other part is we don't know what's going to happen. The best player that's picked in this draft might come at number 17 or 23 or 20. Who knows? This is a wide open NHL draft. Can't wait to see what happens. We'd mentioned the number 1 pick and what happens there, but there is all sorts of intrigue, Scott, about the number 2 pick and the New Jersey Devils, who are waiting. I'm curious to see, first off, do the Canadiens indeed take Shane Wright? That seems to be some of the consensus out there. But if not, or even if they do, will Tom Fitzgerald's phone begin to ring on the draft floor saying, hey, let's swap. We're at number 4. We're at number 6. We want to make our way up to number 2. And here's what we're going to give you to make it worth your while. And not only that, Scott, but the idea that the New Jersey Devils have been in the hunt for so many different players on the trade market. Is this the moment that they get a deal done with someone to say, hey, we're in a spot where we need to take the next step forward with our franchise, and we need to be competitive this year. We're going to take the certain player that we know that's going to produce instead of a player that might take a few years and may not be as much of an impact player.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point. And to me, New Jersey is one of those teams that you could realistically see being enticed to move out of that prestigious number 2 spot, right? I mean, it's all teams would love to have a pick that high. I think New Jersey, especially given the fact that they have 2 recent number 1 overall picks in Nico Hischier and Jack Hughes, they're really set down the middle. And there has to be pressure on Tom Fitzgerald and Lindy Ruff and the rest of that team. It was a disappointing season for them last year. Signed Dougie Hamilton in the offseason. There were a ton of injuries. Goaltending, once again, did not measure up in New Jersey. I think there is a lot of pressure for this team to take a significant step forward. I don't know if they're a playoff team or not, but boy, they better play meaningful games come February and March next year. I think it's time for that franchise. And so, if Tom Fitzgerald's phone is ringing and there's a possibility of moving down, but bringing in an NHL-ready player or a player right on the cusp that you don't have to wait 2 or 3 years for, my guess is that Tom Fitzgerald is ready and willing to listen to every single call. I don't know. I don't mind the winger. I'm going to look at my notes here.
Uri Slavkovsky.
Thank you very much.
The big Slovak.
Well, and that's the interesting part for me is that, again, given their depth, youthful depth down the middle, does Slavkovsky become another piece that you put in that puzzle? You have to wait maybe a year or 2 for him to really blossom into an NHL player. We saw that with Jack Hughes. But I would think that has to be a consideration, too, when Tom Fitzgerald is thinking about what to do with that number 2 pick.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, Slavkovsky could very well go number 1, and there just seemed to be a lot of talk here in Montreal about the idea of the Devils taking a defenseman. Maybe they go and dig a little bit deeper to get the guy that they want for their blue line. That could be a key part of their future. Let's talk about trade targets. And we had Alex DeBrincat. He's been number 1 on our board for the entire offseason to this point. There's some significant pressure on the Blackhawks to move DeBrincat before 7 p.m. or at some point during this first round because they want to get into the top 10 if they can. They are embarking on a tear it down to the studs rebuild. They've got a lot going on, a lot of different irons in the fire. And then there's JT Miller from the Vancouver Canucks. They're in a spot where when you look at JT Miller, the season he had, 99 points, the negotiations that have sort of stalled to this point. I reported yesterday that they met with JT Miller's camp here in Montreal on Tuesday. They remain far apart on a contract extension. It seems like JT Miller wants to go back and play in the U.S. when things are all said and done. That's my belief in terms of signing a contract extension. There's not necessarily the same urgency that exists for the Canucks to move Miller tonight, but they would also potentially have the opportunity to get a quality pick that they could inject into their system and their prospects. And Patrick Allvin, big draft guy, has spent his entire career in the scouting world. That's certainly a possibility, if not a probability, as this day goes on here between JT Miller, between Alex DeBrincat. There's a lot of different balls in the air. Which one intrigues you more?
Yeah, I am curious about JT Miller because there's so much. We've been talking about it for months and months now. You go back to the trade deadline, which for me made the most sense. If you were Vancouver and you could have asked the Kings ransom, and I'm sure they did, leading up to the trade deadline, because then you're looking at 2 playoff runs. The fact that he's entering a contract year, to me, that makes it a little bit more difficult if you're an acquiring team. How much do you give up for a player? Unless you're locked in and believe, in your heart of hearts that you can extend him, you can't afford to be sending out assets, whether it's a first-round pick or a collection of high-end prospects and picks. You can't do that unless you think you can keep JT Miller in the fold. So, to me, it limits it a little bit. But he's such a good player, and I know
such an impact player.
And the New York Rangers, his former team they're.
What about the Devils? Could
Devils?
They be getting the number 2 overall pick back in a package for JT Miller? It seems like a bit of a stretch given the impact of that player, but I don't know. This is a 99-point guy that we're talking about. The problem is with DeBrincat, with Miller, you need to pay those guys in a year's time, and that's going to be very expensive for both of them.
Well, and I think it also, speaks to the idea, well, if you're Vancouver, you're okay having JT Miller in your roster to start the season, but are you thinking ahead? Do you have to trade him at the trade deadline instead of letting him walk? What if you're on a playoff bubble? That team should be in the mix, I think, in the Pacific Division. It does certainly create more calm, I would think, if you can deal JT Miller.
Well, it gives you cap flexibility too.
Yeah, sure.
Now going into your summer, hey, that's been their big buzzword, right? From Jim Rutherford, their president of hockey ops, saying we need cap flexibility. Yep. If you're not keeping JT Miller, you don't want to head into next season with JT Miller to be in a spot where, hey, we're in the playoff chase with JT Miller, and now we might have to keep him because even though we know we're not re-signing him, I think you want to head this off at the pass.
Agreed.
And at the same time, even though it's only $5.25 million, it's still significant cap flexibility for your team this summer to make other moves and to, take those assets that you gain and make your team better and more competitive, if at all possible, when trading a 99-point player. But Alex DeBrincat, keep an eye on the Hawks because they are itching to get into that first round. So if it's going to happen, there's a real good chance that it happens tonight. And if not, something that may linger into next season and the trade deadline. But the interest has been there. The fear with Miller, with DeBrincat is what's that next deal cost? And so that's been the tough part. So let's talk about draft day surprises. What is potentially could be in the hopper to knock your socks off and surprise you a bit. There's a number of teams, and we'll take a look at the board, that have significant numbers of picks, multiple first-round picks, multiple second-round picks that could be in a position to deal them. You look at the Buffalo Sabres and Arizona Coyotes, they each have 3. The Canadiens, Wild, Jets, and Blue Jackets each have a pair. Feels like a big day for the Sabres. They've got it. They're another team. You talked about the Devils. Let's make some progress here on our rebuild. Kevin Adams has had a couple years at the helm now, 3 first-round picks. A potential opportunity there, and an interesting report from Elliot Friedman at Sportsnet in the last hour or so saying that Ottawa and Buffalo had a deal worked out to trade Matt Murray to Buffalo. We know that the Sens have been trying to get out of that contract with Matt Murray. The thing is, the Sabres were on Matt Murray's no trade list, and he ended up blocking the trade. They would have had to give up an asset to send Matt Murray to Buffalo.
Right.
So what other surprises, what other tricks are up these GM sleeves, and who stands out to you as a team that we should keep our eye on?
Well, yeah, and I agree with you entirely on Buffalo and, of course, Arizona, which has 450 picks in this draft, or give or take. But the team I'm really curious about, Jarmo Kekalainen and the Columbus Blue Jackets.
I was going to say that.
Yeah, 2 first-round
picks.
Under
the radar.
And significant picks, too, 6 and 12. And there, again, I think when you look at the move last year with Seth Jones going to Chicago and the young assets that have come in and are being accumulated in Columbus, and I just think Jarmo Kekalainen is a guy who is not afraid to swing for the fences. I don't think that team is that far away. I know they took a step back last year. I don't think they're that far away from being back in the playoff hunt there. I like their pieces. They're young. They've got a lot of upside there. And maybe it's a move that makes them better in the short term. And with 2 prime picks like that, does Jarmo Kekalainen feel a little bit better about maybe putting one into play?
Yeah, well, he's also another guy that came up through scouting circles, so he understands the value of homegrown talent and would certainly value those number 6 and 12 overall picks. Throw 2 names that you related to Columbus. One, Jacob Chikrin. I think they've certainly been in the mix for the Arizona Coyotes defenseman. And the other is, it's been tough to smoke out some teams that are in on Alex DeBrincat. I think the Columbus Blue Jackets could make a lot of sense. They've lost some high talent forwards over the last number of years. Even think of the Chicago connection with Artemi Panarin and some others that have been through there. DeBrincat, 2-time 40-goal scorer. I do think that there are some teams that are curious, Scott, about the idea of what will DeBrincat's production look like if he doesn't play with Patrick Kane. That might sort of set that back a little bit, but I mean, if you're looking to build in Columbus, 40-goal scorer and Alex DeBrincat, who fits your age scheme with some cap space, seems to make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, no, I agree. And the thing, when you go back to the Seth Jones deal, listen, we talk about drafting and developing. Yes, it's critically important, but developing is the key. So if you end up trading an asset like Seth Jones, you bring in young assets, or I think of the Dubois deal and Jack Roslovic. If it doesn't necessarily have to be your pick that you develop, but if you're bringing in a 22, 23-year-old player, that's young enough that you qualify as developing them, even though they may not have been your pick. And I think that's where Columbus is at. It's not necessarily do we have to pick them, but as long as we get them at a young age, and they become Blue Jackets moving forward, I think the key is the age part of it.
Yeah, and pardon the pun, but the devil, as we've talked about draft picks and the New Jersey Devils and all that's going on here, easier to take a guy that is producing at a 40-goal level rather than to take a chance on a guy that you hope may eventually get there, may not. We'll see what happens. So many things on the go, so many balls in the air. Let's talk and dive in deeper to that top 10 and the NHL draft with Chris Peters. Pleased to welcome back to the Daily Faceoff Show, Chris Peters, who joins us for another edition of The Next Wave, delivered by DoorDash from the Peters Draft headquarters. So, Chris, when you take a look at everything that's going on, I want to throw a hypothetical your way, because we mentioned the idea of the New Jersey Devils potentially taking a defenseman. I know that we've talked a lot about this, and you were the first guy that was on the case in terms of mentioning that Shane Wright may not be the consensus number 1 overall pick. It's a dirty hypothetical to throw at you, but if Shane Wright doesn't go number 1, the big talk and the question I've gotten from scouts and other front office types over the last few days is, how far might Shane Wright fall? Could he go to 3? Could he go to 4? Could he go beyond that? How do you see it all working out?
Yeah, it's hard to imagine that the Devils would make that pick, that Shane Wright or Logan Cooley, either the top 2 centers, if they're still there. It's just one of those things where the way that the draft board worked out for you, you've got 2 number 1 picks that are already centers on your team. You've got Dawson Mercer, who I think is a long-term center for them in the 3 hole. So, really you have to decide. And I think it would make sense to get some of those defensemen, to go after a Simon Nemec or David Jiricek. You bolster the right side of your defense. You get a little bit of an opportunity to continue that dynamic puck-moving element. I think the thing about the Devils, the guys the Devils could draft in this particular instance, is that, neither of them, they kind of have what those guys do. David Jiricek might be a bit of an option because he's bigger, he's stronger, but Nemec is certainly the more dynamic and offensively gifted of the 2 players. So it's a really tough call. And that's why I think, a lot of people have kind of looked, maybe they trade the pick, maybe they trade down. Is there an opportunity to move this way or that way? It's really tough to say. So I do think that if Shane Wright were there, that they would pass on him. I think that Slafkovsky is kind of the perfect fit for them right now to be a top line winger. And if he's not on the board, and there's no guarantee, we don't know what Montreal is going to do yet. We've heard plenty with it. They're going to take Slafkovsky. They're going to take Wright. Kent Hughes even said, "Hey, maybe we'll take Logan." Logan Cooley's one of the guys in the mix for the pick. It's really tough to say exactly what they're going to do, but I think that if it came down to it, just to answer your question very simply, if Shane Wright was still on the board, I do not think he would be the pick for the Devils, and maybe goes to 3, maybe goes to 4. I mean, really, it's a tough call to say where he's going to go, but a draft day slide is at least possible for the number 1 overall, and who would have thought that a few months ago?
Chris, it's interesting. I was chatting with an assistant GM yesterday, and we were just talking about the fluidity in the draft and something I hadn't really thought about, but he still feels that the COVID implications, especially for players coming out of the Ontario Hockey League, is a very real part about the draft evaluation and coming up with draft lists. And maybe that's why we're all over the map with so many players in this draft. And maybe that's maybe a reason that Shane Wright stock is in a little bit more ebb and flow to it in the days leading up to the draft. But I wonder if you think that's fair, that with players missing so much time with COVID, especially in the OHL, that maybe it's created just another dynamic going into this draft that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Scott. I mean, really, and I totally agree. I think that we've lost so many benchmark events in a draft season where, losing the World Juniors was a big thing too, because we would have had Logan Cooley, Uri Slafkovsky, and Shane Wright all in the same tournament. And we got a small glimpse of them. Wasn't a great showing for Shane Wright, was a pretty good showing for the other 2. But either way, we're not going to use those 2 games or 3 games in the crazy COVID situation that happened at the World Juniors as an evaluation point. So you lose those evaluation points, and it makes the decision a little less clear. And then in Shane Wright's case, missing an entire year of development, you have to take that into account when you're projecting his ceiling. How much did that set him back? Does he need to go back to junior for another year? Does he need to find a way? Would he have been more dominant if he just kind of continued on the trend from his rookie season? The thing that we've all been saying is the upside is in question, because he hasn't progressed at the level that you would expect an exceptional status player who had a higher points per game average than Connor McDavid at the same age, at 15, in that season that was shortened by COVID. And then what he is now. We haven't seen necessarily that progression. He hasn't had the opportunity to play. So, there are a lot of different questions that you have to ask yourself, and it absolutely is a huge factor in why we are so uncertain of how this is going to go.
So, Chris, give us some intel on who's the biggest wild card in round one. I've heard lots of talk about lots of different names that could be all over the board depending on who you're speaking to. We've talked about Brad Lambert. We've talked about Marco Kasper as a guy that I think a lot of teams potentially see in the top 10. Sometimes some teams see him a little bit further down. Liam Ogren is a guy that you focused on as a real late riser that's garnered some attention. Give us one guy to think about as we head into round one.
Yeah, I think the biggest wild card for me heading into round one is Brad Lambert, and to a lesser degree, the Russian players as well. I think that's a huge wild card that it's getting harder and harder to say where those players are going to go. But I think Brad Lambert is the one because he's the best skater in this draft, I think. Him and Logan Cooley are kind of 1A, 1B in terms of the skating ability. I think Lambert's a little bit smoother. So he has NHL traits. You see that in his game. The issue with him right now that I've seen is, I'll talk to a lot of scouts after my rankings came out. I had him 25th on my final rankings. I know a few others don't see him as a first-round prospect, but there are a lot of teams that say, look at the skills. We got to take a chance on that because there's at least something there. And so I think he could go as early as the middle of the first round to out of the first round entirely. And that's a player that we're going to be watching for years and years to see who was right, because this is a guy we were talking about 2 years ago as the primary challenger to Shane Wright. And now we're at a point where we're talking about the possibility of neither of them going first. And in the case of Brad Lambert, maybe not going in the first round. So I think he's an interesting prospect. There are plenty of, red flags in terms of just his production, moving 3 teams in 3 years, all these different things that scouts care about. But it all comes back to that base of skills. And he has an elite one. He's got that elite skating ability and high-end skill.
No doubt someone will take a chance on Brad Lambert, just a question of when. So glad that we took a chance on Chris Peters here on the Daily Faceoff team. Having you on board all season long, you absolutely crushed it in your draft coverage throughout the season. If you haven't been following Chris's work, read his top 100. He's got at least a couple paragraphs on all of his top 100 picks on dailyfaceoff.com. He's got mock drafts. He's got everything you could possibly imagine leading up to it. Chris, you've covered it soup to nuts. Thank you so much for everything you've done for us, and best of luck in your new adventure at Flow Hockey.
Hey, thanks a lot, guys. It has been an honor to work with you and a huge pleasure to be a part of this team. Big things are happening at DFO, and just really excited to have been a part of it for this entire draft season. I thank everybody that's followed the work along the way.
Can't wait to follow along with your coverage of draft night as well. Chris Peters, this has been the next wave delivered by DoorDash. You see the promo codes there at the bottom of your screen. DFODD if you're in Canada, DFODD US if you're in the United States. That gets you 25% off and free delivery on your first order. It's day one of the NHL Draft. So many things happening. You don't want to cook. All your favorites and more delivered right to your door by DoorDash. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, guys.
All right, Scott, it's time for our Daily Faceoff inbox question of the day. Hit us up on Twitter, #AskDFO. So we've got 32 tables behind us here on the draft floor at the Bell Center. Which one would you most like to be sitting at? Which one would you most like to be a fly on the table as opposed to a fly on the wall on draft night?
That's a great question. And I'm really curious to see what happens to the Arizona Coyotes. I know, listen, it's been tough for them, right? There's lots of stuff.
This is their Super Bowl.
This is their Super Bowl. But having had a chance to chat with Bill Armstrong not too long ago, and I know you did too, in recent weeks as well, it's been a difficult process for the team in terms of how they're building that roster. And there have been some really hard decisions made by the Coyotes. But you're right, this is their Super Bowl. This is where they're going to restock the larder, if you will. What it's going to look like there in 2 or 3 years is going to depend very much on what happens tonight and tomorrow. and you know that this is short-term pain. Hopefully it's short-term pain, but certainly shortish pain for long-term gain if that franchise is ever really going to achieve what I think is potential in the desert there, well on their way hopefully to getting a new arena in Tempe in that area. But this draft is critical for them, and they have so many moving parts, and I'm really curious to see how Bill Armstrong and his staff, they handle it all. There's a lot going on for them. I mean, just think about, we talked about teams that, if you have 2 picks in the first round, or maybe you just have the 1 and still the pressure to make the right choice. A lot of pressure on the Arizona Coyotes, and I'm curious to see how they come through all of this.
Yeah, I think for me, the table that I'd most like to be sitting at, the Colorado Avalanche, the one furthest away from the draft floor, and the reason for that is because they have a Stanley Cup that they could just put on the table for everyone to stare at. They've got some Stanley Cup rings on the way, and they've also got no pressure, no pick in the first round. They traded it away. They're in a spot where they can kind of sit back and relax and maybe just focus on some of their offseason moves and trying to keep all of their guys. In this case, the table I least like to be at. I know Kent Hughes said it's great to have choice, but it doesn't matter what happens, whether you take Wright, whether you take Slavkovsky, whether you take Logan Cooley, whoever it is, better get it right, because this draft in this city, probably a pretty good reminder for teams, hey, don't bid on the draft if our team might not be good, because you don't want that pressure. I don't think you want that pressure of stepping up to that stage. Could be great theater, could be one of those picks that you remember forever, might also be one that you want to forget.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it as well. I mean, but Kent Hughes, I think, is in a good spot, with coming in, hired by Jeff Gordon. There really is, I think, a new breath of fresh air around the entire organization, just in terms of how they do their business. They are thinking outside the box. They're doing things a little bit differently. I agree with you. There is a huge, you better get this right. But I think they will get it right. And I think they are a franchise that they're embracing this. And I know the city's embracing it. I am curious to see what's the final call and what's the reaction. But I'm
from
looking
all the
forward
experts
to it.
that are
all
in the,
the
I mean,
experts.
that's the
well,
one
there's
thing
only
that kind of
20,000 experts.
But that's kind of drives me crazy, though, is how many, and I'm not, you're a fan, you buy a ticket, you have a right to express yourself however you want. But how many minutes of hockey did you watch of Shane Wright, of Uri Slavkovsky, of Logan Cooley? My guess is probably not much more than 2. So lots of draft experts in the building. We have our draft expert that joined us today, and Chris Peters, Scott Burnside. That brings us to garbage time, and certainly not a garbage situation. Yeah. Our hearts go out to the Bryan Marchment family.
Yeah, and it's just so shocking to hear that Bryan Marchment had died, a scout for the San Jose Sharks, come to Montreal to get ready for the draft. Of course, a lot, so much change going on with the San Jose Sharks. And Mike Greer, I just saw him a few minutes ago, hired as the first Black GM in NHL history.
What a tough first day on the job.
And what a Paul cast over. Really not just the San Jose Sharks organization, although Bryan Marchment's so intrinsically tied to the culture and identity of that team, first as a player and then as a longtime scout and someone who's been really involved in that community and with that organization. Years ago, when he was still playing in San Jose, I spent some time with Bryan at his house in San Jose. I got to tell you, he was not all that thrilled about the idea to begin with. But the Sharks sold him on it, but he could not have been more gracious. Spent time with him. We talked about his playing career, which is fairly controversial, of course, given the way he played the game. And for years after, whenever we would run into each other, he always just a very professional gentleman, couldn't have been nicer to me over the years whenever we crossed paths. And I know in talking to people close to that Sharks organization, it's going to take a long time to get over this. And you couldn't have said it better. We send all our thoughts to the Marchment family and to the organization as a whole.
Yeah, a heart and soul player, and the hearts are broken of the San Jose Sharks and a lot of other teams around the hockey world, the Edmonton Oilers, the other teams that Bryan Marchment played for. Mike Greer, that was his teammate in Edmonton, and it's his first day on the job. He is now one of his employees and passes away here in Montreal. Tough spot, thinking also, of course, of his son, Mason. Mason had a tremendous season this year for the Florida Panthers, 48 points. Unrestricted free agent this summer. tough spot for him and his family to be in. Our thoughts and prayers are with them, and certainly going to be thinking of them and the Sharks and Oilers family as the NHL draft gets underway. Here are the festivities, 7 p.m. Keep it locked on dailyfaceoff.com for all the latest news, insight, and analysis in the run-up to the draft. Lots of different balls in the air. Scott, it's going to be fun. It was great to be alongside you here from the Bell Center. That'll do it for today's edition of the Daily Faceoff Show. Rounds 2 through 7 will be on Friday afternoon and morning, and we won't have a Daily Faceoff Show then, but we'll be back to you on Monday, getting you set for free agency and all that's to come next week. Thanks for joining us. Wait, round 1 and all the drama that comes with it.
Thanks for watching the Daily Faceoff Show.
Make sure you hit subscribe on our YouTube channel to never miss an episode.